in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm very excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Garrison Gibbons. He is the VP of People at Amun 21Shares. Garrison, it is really good to see you. Thank you so much for being a guest. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns, and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yes, I do. So my name is Garrison Gibbons. My pronouns are he and they, and I run HR at Amun and 21Shares, which are two brands underneath one parent company, which the name is to be determined as we're about to relaunch our parent company name publicly in the coming weeks and months. And we work in the crypto space. So we work on digital assets and crypto technology, aka blockchain, and have a few products in that space. When I was a child, the answer to what do I want to be when I grew up was a talk show host. I really wanted to have my own talk show. So that was my first answer from the time of 6 and kind of stayed consistent through high school when I thought about going into broadcast journalism. But ultimately read a report in a career studies class that the broadcast journalism career would decrease by 50% by 2020. So I thought that would not be a wise decision. So I didn't do that. Instead, I went to school for theater, which made zero sense either. So that's a little bit of my story and kind of the logistics of how that dream was a dream deferred, if you will.
So just to be clear, your answer wasn't, I want to be in crypto when you were younger?
It was not. I had no vision of technology in the slightest bit.
Neither did I, but we do share when I was younger, I also wanted to be a talk show host. So now I definitely love doing this and speaking with people like yourself. And I have a ton of questions to ask you, starting from kind of your experience in the field and the really mission-driven organizations you have worked for, which is incredible. I read that you were hire number 5 at Rumble. I've been to a couple classes, love a good workout. And sometimes people have misconceptions around when you bring in a people or human resources person until you are X number of employees, or you need to have at least 100 employees. What is your philosophy around this? Why is this a myth?
Yeah, I remember when I first started getting semi-interested in the space of, HR people, talent, and the number was not 100 at that time. It was like far more than that. It was like 175, 200, 300. And then I think startup companies really started valuing the first HR hire around that 100 mark, and then it quickly changed to 100. And you would often hear people in conversation be like, "Oh no, it makes no sense to hire that person at 25 or 50." I do think that has evolved over time, and especially in the world that we find ourselves in now, like I think it is almost impossible probably to even be a 25-person organization and not have someone designated, even if they're a catch-all, to being the people HR talent person. I do think it's a misconception ultimately because even when you have 5 employees, they need a resource. And more often than not, especially in the tech space and especially in organizations where co-founders are, launching their first company more often than not, fall between the age of 25 and 35, have had a very short professional career before developing their own own company. I think ultimately that is one of the reasons for this hire and why it becomes really necessary. There have definitely been companies that I've interviewed for or even been a part of where I think I was either potentially hired too soon for that organization. And so I do think it's somewhat personal to the organization in the sense that the co-founders have to be open to hiring this person and not like hiring it to check a box or reluctantly hire this person. And ultimately too, the team and the overall growth trajectory of the company kind of impacts what type of profile you need and who you need in that role. So I do think that there is sometimes a number that is actually more appropriate for that individual organization, for better or for worse, right? Just due to the internal politics or dynamics of the company. But I do think that the arbitrary 100 people plus is kind of a number that's just thrown out there, and probably I would venture to say in today's organization is far too late for the first hire.
Absolutely. There's no black and white decisions, but having that proactivity and also setting that person up or the department up for success, having the support of senior leaders as well, co-founders, CEOs, that is really important in terms of the industry and the field of itself. I know a lot of people have strong opinions around human resources and people teams, especially folks who are not in it. And some organizations say they have a quote unquote open door policy, but we know historically employees are a little bit hesitant to come to HR. They might think of them as the principal's office or something like that. What are some methods you use to really build trust internally with your organization to really encourage people to surface positive feedback as well, not just negative feedback, but to you and your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one's has been hard to navigate throughout my career, and there have been moments where I've really hit this out of the park, and moments where I really probably dropped the ball. I think early on in my career, I thought the only way to build trust was by self-deprecation and like really exposing my own personal trauma and experiences, and I think I used that as a mechanism of saying I'm no different than you. And now reflecting back on that, like I think there were times where I did that. I did that at the service of the company, but not at a service to myself. Like there were times I talked about things that I personally went through that I probably wasn't ready to share or probably shouldn't have shared, like from a mental health and wellness perspective. But I did because I was so desperate to break that barrier and say, hey, look, I went through this experience at work, or I went through this experience personally, and I can share like this, like from a place of, openness and authenticity in hopes that you return that. So that's how I started it. And I would say, like, protect yourself and think about yourself as well, like while you're navigating that, as I think I learned that the hard way as I kind of sometimes expose things maybe a little bit too soon. And if you look at my LinkedIn, you could probably see, how raw I've been at times where maybe I wouldn't be today as much or as often. Despite how helpful some other people found it, it maybe wasn't the best thing for me at that moment. But then, of course, you also reach a level, now being VP of people, I think it's harder for me to have trust than maybe some of the individuals on my team who are kind of in the trenches, so to speak, and people see as a little bit more approachable than myself. So I do think the closer you get to C-suite, or the closer you get to the co-founders, or the closer you're tied to the organization, the harder that trust is to establish. And so in some ways, it's almost going to be impossible, right? Because you have to represent the business as well as the people. And so one of the things I've done as I've grown is I've really made sure that I hired individuals who were me 3-4 years ago, right? Who were really into really the culture champion, individual champions, like ICs or individual contributors that are approachable to each office or each team. Like they have their own people that they know who to go to. And I really reinforce that and say, if you have any questions, go to X person on my team or Y person on my team. And then work on ways that I can also continue to build trust, whether that be through office hours or, time where I'm just fully available on Slack, or where I open up my calendar, right? So I think it's a fine line. I do think it's something that I'm still struggling with, especially as I've grown in my career, where inherently my title or my strategic hat or things of that nature have naturally made me maybe less trustworthy or less approachable, if nothing else. And that's been really difficult for me, as I think this is the reason why I got into HR, was to kind of be that trustworthy partner. And it is hard as you get, as you get more oversight, or you inherently just get, closer to a leadership role, you inherently lose that piece for multiple reasons. But ultimately, I do think organizations, my advice would be to be careful about what you say about open door policies and transparency. I think it's easy for everyone to value that. I personally do, but there are some organizations that are inherently less transparent than others, and that is okay. But I think the mistake is falsely selling that you were super transparent, and then you're a bank, right? And there's only so much transparency you can be, or you work in constant stealth mode, and you can't really be an organization where transparency, or you value secrecy and you think teams work better against each other, right? Like there are different cultures and organizations out there, and I think it's often easy in the HR world to hop on a bandwagon and be like, we have to be transparent because everyone is. And it's like, but if that goes against your fundamental being as a company, maybe don't sell that false promise. And so I think, every organization has a responsibility to have some level of an open door policy, I believe, in today's age, but you really should make sure that what you're putting out there in that policy is true to the organization, is true to the co-founders, is true to the leadership, and is actually something you can live up to every day. Because I think more than anything, a blanket statement being published, the employees are going to expect you to return that promise. And if you can't live up to it, you're kind of setting up your team, your organization, and ultimately the company up for some level of failure. And so I think you kind of do have to personalize it to the organization that you find yourself in.
You have to have that alignment between what you say you value, what you actually value, and what you practice as well, and really be authentic as a leader. As you started off with talking about kind of your personal experience and how you've grown and shared and been vulnerable and done that internal work too, and the self-awareness, and also recognizing the power dynamics that exist if you are a VP as opposed to a manager, as opposed to a peer as well, and really creating a team to really support that too and build that trust at scale. And again, in an intentional way, it doesn't just happen because you will it to happen too. And another thing in terms of intentionality for your individual career has been the kinds of organizations you have chosen to work for. You have exclusively worked for companies who have made a societal impact. Love that. What role do you see private organizations or employers really playing and making their communities and the world kind of a better place and the impact they can have?
Yeah, so I'll use this as an opportunity to plug my, I think, responsibility as a millennial to say I am a millennial. Yeah, and I actually got into, I was on a panel recently, and this topic kind of came up of what is a company's responsibility, and I had a very firm millennial view, and there was a different view in the room, and they combated me a little bit on the topic, and so I love this exchange because I do think it is interesting, but I think my generation, and definitely I'm seeing these same, and if not more, identifiers in the Gen Z community and generation as well, that we grew up in an age where companies evolved, right? And companies were asked, challenged, and are continue to be, to respond to things that matter to the public, or in private companies, the employees and the people that they're attempting to hire, right? And so I personally believe that a company has a moral, social responsibility to make the world a better place. Maybe it's in their niche area, right? Like the company I was at before this was a marketing technology company. That's a very niche market, and maybe it's just making marketing better. Maybe it's making a very particular content marketers, right, as a role, as a function better. So it doesn't have to be global necessarily, but I think companies do have a moral and social obligation to make an impact in this world. And definitely if you're in the technology space, technology is inherently not equitable, right? Like, especially new technology, a certain group of people get access to that. And so I think as a tech company, where most of these co-founders or founders or early, adopters of technology get into it because they love the fact that it will eventually be accessible, right? And so I think you really have to bring that inward. And especially in the world that we are in today, where there are constantly, there's civil unrest, there is, there are laws and regulations changing that impact particular communities over others. And granted, that has happened since the history of time, but I think in today's age, things can get elevated quite quickly due to social media or media, right? Ever changing and evolving. That I do think companies, have always had the moral and social responsibility, but have never been asked blatantly by staff to make a comment or to respond as much as they are now. And we see studies that show that millennial and Gen Z employees choose a job based on the alignment morally, socially, and and so forth. That is one of the major things they consider when joining a job. And you see that as well with diversity and inclusion statements and commitments, and global warming or kind of carbon neutral kind of initiatives and things like that. Like, people want to make sure that the company that they're joining aligns with their personal mission, vision, and purpose as much as it does their financial need. And so I think that's really something that's driven me, and I think it's true because not only am I a member of that one of the generations that cares a lot about this, but also that I've happened to work at companies that do almost by like happenstance, I think initially, that do have a really strong mission and vision. It makes my job easier as a talent person. It makes my job easier as an HR person when you're able to champion people behind a mission and vision as much as you are like a cult-like, culture or startup culture, right? Like, that is great. But then also be able to say, hey, we're not only doing something super exciting like cryptocurrency, but we're trying to make it accessible. And we're doing that through X, Y, and Z. And we're reaching generations and different groups of people through these different initiatives. And we're carbon neutral, and we're doing this, right? Like, being able to take that and, run with it 100 times faster, stronger, and better through societal change and impact is so much stronger and has employee like increases employee engagement so much more. And so that's really one reason why I do it, is selfishly, not only because I care about it personally, but also because I see the impacts tenfold as it relates to employee engagement, retention, and so forth.
Absolutely. It's not only a nice to have, but a need to have. There's a lot of research that supports that with people coming into an organization and really a lot of folks asking specific questions about what the impact is in the community, what is the impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion at an organization. And if there is no alignment or if someone is sold something that is not in actuality what's happening at the organization, people are going to leave and they're going to tell their friends, they're going to tell their family about it as well. So it permeates throughout too. In terms of thinking about, I mean, you mentioned earlier, every organization really needs to do that work to see where they are as a company and where their values are. When you're thinking about Amun 21Shares, what are you thinking about in terms of company culture and how you measure it kind of qualitatively and quantitatively, knowing that, this is a dynamic thing that we are talking about as well?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think um, company culture is, the bread and butter of the startup space. Not only the startup space, any kind of hyper growth company, needs to kind of constantly be revisiting the culture as it scales, as it changes, as it evolves, and ensures that what they're putting out into the world, whether that be on, a career page or whether that be, in interviews, is also what's happening and at the real life activation of that culture every single day. And so to me, where I'm really prioritizing a lot of my time as it relates to culture today is around that activation. How are we living up to that in programming? How is culture being brought up in performance reviews or promotion considerations or anything of that nature? How are we, appropriately ensuring that bias is not fully, affecting the way that we assess culture in talent interviews or things of that nature? The whole culture add versus value kind of conversation that I know a lot of people in the HR space have constantly. And so I think those are all really true and necessary. And one of the things that I want to really move us to is the championing of the culture, culture, whether that be through identifying culture champions, creating ERGs that are geared towards people who really value the culture and want to, make suggestions. But then ultimately, we are hiring a lead of culture and engagement to really take it from where we are now and focus our efforts towards the individualization of culture from a team, location, across departmental perspective, right? Because I think one of the biggest challenges is not always, setting a global company-wide culture, but it's then activating it and personalizing it and letting it evolve and be malleable slightly for each department, team, company, office, whatever. And that's kind of where we are now. We're, 150 employees. We have 2 offices that work in a hybrid environment. We have remote employees across the globe, including, South America, Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and the United States, as well as parts of Asia. And so, we're global in scale, and we need to make sure that our culture is malleable and evolves based on region, based on, local expectations by employees, based on office, based on remote, and ensures that it's consistent while also being slightly malleable based on personal preference or based on team preference, based on work expectation, role, and responsibilities, and so forth. So that's really where we're focused in, Q2, 3, and 4 is now on really activating and taking the culture from what is naturally grown and for this company, Amun 21Shares, like it grew primarily during COVID. So, it grew in a hybrid remote world in a very interesting way. And there's a lot of pluses and minuses of that growth happening in that time period to now, what does it look like when we are, go from 150 employees to now 300 in the next 6 to 9, maybe 12 months. And so that's really where, the attention is focused in the next, few quarters.
Absolutely. Especially at a global organization, I feel like a lot of folks are talking about that personalization at scale. When we talk about company culture and employee experience, it's very individual. So, how do we create the tools, resources, the non negotiables, common language, the values, the frameworks, I guess, if you will, for different departments, locations, and regions to really use those to create their own kind of culture under that too with the same values. When Garrison's not in the room, when the new hire who will help build that culture is not in the room. How do you think about really empowering folks across the organization to practice equity-driven leadership and really think about that accountability and empowerment? If you have any examples there.
Yeah, so one of our core values at my current company is own your shit, which was a very heated, somewhat heated conversation around do we use the word shit? Because globally, especially in Switzerland, where one of our offices is, that terminology might not be, highly sought after by employees or companies or clients. And so, we might change the phrasing of it down the road. But I think ultimately what we were attempting to get at was that accountability piece and the empowerment piece. I think one major reason, especially in today's world where, the pool table and cold brew on tap and all of that might not be as palpable, right? But one of the reasons why people join a startup company or a hypergrowth company is because they will be given the opportunity to fully own and execute at scale. They'll be given opportunities that they would not be get at a legacy or large scale organization where most of the roles are predetermined, predefined, and there's a lot of quote unquote red tape, right? And so we understand that responsibility at Amun 21Shares, and we really want to ensure that we're creating a culture where people are empowered and actually given the full opportunity to own and execute in their area of expertise. And so we basically fully believe, and when we set out to hire, we aim to hire people that are better at the craft that we're hiring for than we personally are, than the manager is, than the team currently is, to bring in experts that can take the role and fully run with it, right? And so that's really one way that we bring this into our culture to ensure that we're living up to not only the expectation of people joining a startup company, which is to be able to own and execute and have full accountability of their area, but two, to also bring in subject matter experts in areas to really take our company and elevate and innovate, at scale, right? So if you just look at my HR team, I brought on talent people who are far better recruiters than I will ever be, better sourcers than I will ever be. We've brought on HR generalists who are experts in not only employee benefits and perks and all of that, but are also just really approachable, really intelligent people who are just able to execute across different regions and research like on the fly in an incredible way, and more process driven than I ever will be. I brought on a talent operations lead who is incredible at cross-departmental and cross-functional work as it relates to what talent operations is, which is obviously a nebulous role and nebulous function that can mean a million different things. And just more recently brought on an HR business partner whose sole responsibility is to help, create strategic alignment at scale as it relates to performance reviews, learning and development, and, any kind of HR global initiative like that. And so really, I've even focused personally on bringing on experts who can take certain areas that I've had exposure in, and I tell myself I'm 100% a generalist. I will probably be a generalist, until the day I die. That is where I live and thrive. And so bringing on people who are more specialists, who have expertise, so that they can hold me accountable, hold the company accountable, but also feel empowered to make impact in the areas that they really, excel at. And so when I'm not in the room, I am ensuring that people, when they're having their strategic conversations, particularly hiring managers, on where they want to hire and where they want to add to their team, they're really thinking about this piece and ensuring that if they're going to open up a role, that they have the ability, that role will eventually have the ability to be empowered, have accountability, and ultimately live up to the value of ownership, right? And be able to fully own their function. If not, then that headcount might be redundant, and thus we might not need to have that, right? And so bringing that also into performance conversations for our existing employees is something we're also, constantly thinking about and trying to live up to. So that is something that's very true to our company. But I think ultimately for any startup, you have to I always find myself reminding myself, why are people joining a company like ours that doesn't have every process written out, right? That is so nebulous and so challenging and so at times stressful. Why do people do that? Because of this opportunity. And if we're not giving employees that opportunity, we're not living up to our promise in hiring them.
Absolutely. I think that definitely makes sense. And nobody, I think this is a general statement, but I'm pretty sure nobody likes a micromanager or someone who doesn't fully invest in them as people and believe in their expertise as subject matter experts as well, and supported to have that ownership and accountability to reach their own goals and set them up for success in the role too. And in terms of accountability, I know that we have a lot of conversations around Pride, June 2022. Can't believe we're there already. I want to know how Amun and 21 Shares is honoring and celebrating Pride this year, recognizing that it should not only be 1 month, 1 day, 1 year, or one time, and that supporting LGBTQIA plus employees should be something we're thinking about 365 days a year. But I also want to ask because we've all seen the inauthentic impacts that some companies have had as well, and want to provide best practices for folks who are listening.
Yeah, no, I think this is obviously an important topic in general, but also to me personally as a queer person. It's something I personally feel very strongly about. I've been tokenized as a queer person in the workplace. I've also, been asked and challenged to own pride initiatives from not only internal but also external and everything in between at past companies. And so it is something I'm very cognizant of and passionate about, not only professionally as a queer person, but also then even more so as a visible queer leader that works in HR, right? So I think it's actually very timely because Amun and 21 Shares we are talking about this now, and I'm working in partnership with comms and other leaders and functions. It's also interesting, most of the companies that I have worked for have been very US centric in operation, and so that's a lot of our pride initiatives, right? We're centered around what US pride looks like, and now at a global company there's so many more considerations because pride obviously takes place at many different months during the year, in different regions, right? But also means different things and has different political social expectations. For example, corporatization of pride is a very US specific thing. It's not as much of a known or discussed seeming thing globally as it is as much a part of American pride today. And so that's made this very interesting and like almost a new challenge for me as I've kind of wanted to get involved and figure out what we can do, which is actually really exciting. But I agree. I think ultimately, as a queer person myself, and I don't want to speak obviously for the entire community, but I've been more impressed by companies when there have been random acts of service, kindness, support, communication around the LGBTQ plus community, not during June than I have been during June, right? I think for me personally, June has been a celebratory month and something that is really exciting and fun, member of the community, but also like a really cool educational month where you can really bring a lot of conversations. Like I think Stonewall has been like a huge, kind of historic moment that people have learned about over the last 5 to 10 years. There are millions more that are more important, arguably, than Stonewall is to the LGBTQ community that can be educated. So I do think I personally have always seen June as that, and the rest of the year as being more committed to to supporting LGBTQ employees and communities at work. Whether that be through benefit conversations and open enrollment, whether that be through parental leave policies, whether that be through fertility or kind of, supporting the trans community, et cetera, et cetera. And so I do think that there have been times where organizations have pushed we are going to add partner benefits to our, and they make these big announcements during June, which really it's like, why didn't that happen during open enrollment? Or why is the parental leave policy changing in June when it should have been written initially with LGBTQ members in mind? And so one of the things I always say is, the LGBTQ community can be an invisible community in the sense of you might not know that you have any LGBTQ plus, employees if they do not disclose, open, or if it never comes up in conversation, right? And so thus, I really like to say, do not wait for an LGBTQ ERG to be formed or employees to vocalize that changes need to be happen. When you're writing your policies, when you're reviewing your handbook, when you're going through benefit considerations, like the LGBTQ community should be a part of those considerations because there are so many individual considerations that companies make that impact the LGBTQ community, that you don't even think about. Benefits and parental leave and bathrooms, like all of that is somewhat, palpable to a lot of the US, kind of, HR industry, but there are millions more that you don't think about. And if you're not centering your policy around every employee, whether you know that they exist or not, then you're not actually creating an inclusive environment. You're waiting until an employee raises something to create a more inclusive environment in the future. And so that's really one thing that I really strongly consider in terms of how to support 365 days a year. It's considering the LGBTQ community in every HR consideration, particularly policy, benefit, perk, and work expectation, cultural expectation, right? As possible, not necessarily just during the month of June.
Absolutely. And that is not putting the emotional labor on folks at your organization who have chose to disclose more about their identity, not tokenizing anyone, and really being proactive and thinking about how you could be more inclusive, not siloing out, this is a celebration, but also thinking about healthcare benefits and all of the things that you talked about as well. Another piece of this conversation too, we're all learning and we have this growth mindset. When you know better, you do better. I think it's an Angelou quote. There's been a lot of press and television around toxic workplaces, whether it is hyperbolic with a fictional show or it's a documentary about shows as well. One of them was around Abercrombie and Fitch and the numerous public examples of discrimination, and then others on different networks. I want to ask, from your perspective, is there ever a point of no return for a brand because of the amount of harm they caused? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough one. I think, ultimately, as a consumer, there could be a point of no return, right? Because ultimately, you might, make a determination as a consumer of, wanting to purchase and buy and consume brands that, align with your mission and vision, your worldview, or just, respect you as a basic human being, right? And don't support, organizations that are, attacking your community or against, your individual community or experience. So I think as a consumer, there could be a point of no return. And obviously, as you're considering working in the world or looking for a new employer, there could be a point of no return. I think internally at an organization, I do not believe that there is a point of no return. And the reason being is because I do believe to some extent everyone is replaceable in an organization. And thus, there can be there can be things rooted in an organization that are not tied to individuals, because historically at that organization, things have been accepted. But there are leaders who can come in, and if you do clean house enough, you can build off of a foundation, and just like a house, right? Like there are things you can keep taking away and rebuild if the people in the organization, the shareholders, the board of directors, whatever that may be, are committed to doing that. Now, that is extremely hard to do, and it's not an easy feat. And I do think that there are probably, in the quote about the percentage of restaurants fail, like I'm sure there's a percentage of companies that will fail that do not live up to this moment, right? Or are not able to do this effectively. But maybe it's a little bit of my, my optimism, but I really do believe fundamentally that organizations can change and hopefully can get to a position where they should be able to change. Otherwise, there are a lot of organizations that will not exist in 30 to 40 years, right? Like by 2050, the minorities of the United States will collectively become the majority. Like things are changing, and either companies will live up to the moment and evolve to meet that moment, or they won't. And I really do believe personally that there will be many more companies that fail because they're unable to adjust to the times that we are like that, and evolve over time, right? And so some organizations won't, but I truly believe that there's no reason why a company can't change if there is a shakeup. But I do think it requires a significant shape up for some of these organizations.
Yeah, I appreciate the context behind your answer to that question as well, because there is a consumer side, there's a stakeholder side, employee side, and also if you are there internally as well and you have the intention of changing and there is an authentic commitment of new leadership to really rebuild a brand from its foundation as well. Garrison, I know our time went by really quickly, but is there anything that I didn't ask that you would like to share? Any parting thoughts or 1 to 2 key takeaways you want to underscore for folks who are listening?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to close out on the topic we were just discussing, I've had friends who have gone to organizations where they've joined with the intention of changing the ecosystem, and it is an exhausting effort. And I've seen them get burned out and tired by it. I've been that person from time to time or felt like that person from time to time in an organization or two. And I know how exhausting that is. And there are times where I still beat myself up for not sticking through it longer and seeing it all the way through because I personally couldn't. That also touches on the trauma piece I touched on earlier, the burnout piece, and ultimately the role of HR in today's climate, world, and environment. It is an exhausting um, role and function, but it is so important. And if you have chosen to be in this craft, particularly if you've chosen the last 10 years as the industry has drastically evolved and changed, I think you chose it for a reason. And you chose it because you really do care about the key principles and fundamental ideas of HR and talent and people. And you really want to see companies succeed by their people and live up to the moment of championing their people. And so I think, ultimately, my general advice to people in the HR space is find people, mentors, people outside your organization, therapists, whatever it may be. Find safe spaces consistently, often, and change them up from time to time to go to during this time because it is it is harder now than it ever has been before. I don't know if it'll get easier or if it'll just get more complex as society changes and our world constantly evolves. But the key fundamental thing that I would share is to, really lean on other people. And it doesn't have to be other HR people. It doesn't have to be, other working professionals. It doesn't have to be a therapist, but find safe spaces constantly and consistently to make sure that you are taking care of yourself because it really is putting the mask on, or whatever kind of the airplane saying is, supporting yourself before you support others. It's really a key fundamental thing. And I have not been the best at doing it myself, but it is something I'm constantly trying to recenter around in this world that we find ourselves in. And so that would just be my general advice to anyone who's out there fighting the good fight, changing an organization, and removing the like rotting wood, to sharing their trauma at work, to rolling out LGBTQ plus initiatives, to whatever it may be, whatever we touched on today, like whatever you're working on and championing and fighting for, continue to fight, but also take time to restore, rest, and take care of yourself because that's the only way that you're going to be able to take care of other people.
Absolutely. I think that is a great call to action. You are not alone in this work. You are doing great work as well. And Garrison, thank you so much for sharing your story and your advice in our conversation today and being a guest on Reimagining Company Culture.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening on AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.